Imagine a world where the hands that tucked you in at night, the hands that folded in prayer on Sunday morning, were the same hands that stirred death into your coffee. A grandmother's hands, gentle, wrinkled, kind, until they weren't. Now imagine you were the one sipping from that poisoned cup, smiling at the woman who prayed for your soul while orchestrating your slow, agonizing demise. This is not fiction. This is not folklore. This is the life and the death of Velma Barfield, and by the time you finish hearing her story, you may never look at trust, faith, or even family the same way again. Before we fall into this shadowed history, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because in towns like yours, in families like yours, evil has often worn its kindest mask. Between 1969 and 1978, 6 bodies dropped into the earth of Cumberland County, North Carolina. Each death appeared natural, tragic, explainable. Violent stomach pain, relentless vomiting, agony so intense that doctors wrote it off as gastroenteritis, heart failure, or just bad luck. And through it all, a soft-spoken church-going grandmother hovered nearby, stroking foreheads, whispering prayers, attending funerals with tears that seemed real enough to convince everyone but the dead. Her name was Velma, and she had discovered a terrible secret, that death could be disguised, that poison, hidden inside soup or tea, could pass as God's will. She wasn't the first to learn this, and she won't be the last. But Velma was one of the rare ones who learned to perfect it. And that's why you're here, not just to learn about a killer grandmother, but to glimpse how evil cloaks itself in innocence, how power manipulates appearances, and how institutions, from the church pew to the courtroom, often aid the deceiver more than the victim. But let's step back, because to understand Velma, you must first understand the world that created her. A world of red clay fields and wooden churches, where family reputation mattered more than evidence, and where women like Velma were invisible until they weren't. She was born in 1932, the oldest daughter in a family of 9 children. Poor, overworked, starved for control in a household dominated by a father whose word was law. These were the seeds, the psychological soil, that would one day bloom into murder. In her early life, she was quiet, helpful, intelligent. Teachers saw potential in her. Neighbors saw a shy girl who might escape poverty if she played her cards right. But the truth was, Velma never escaped. Poverty clung to her. Duty bound her. Her life was stripped of choices, and choices are the currency of power. So when power finally revealed itself to her in the form of poison, it must have felt like freedom. Her first marriage to Thomas Burke seemed like an exit, but it soon rotted under the weight of alcohol, medical debts, and resentment. His accident left him half a man, trapped in pain, drowning in liquor. She watched him disintegrate, her own faith in God cracking under the burden of survival. But the fire that ended Thomas's life, that was no accident. That was Velma's first rehearsal, her first taste of what it meant to turn chaos into advantage. A widow with insurance money, a survivor draped in sympathy, a woman who could smile at the congregation and hide the blood beneath her fingernails. And the community, her community, applauded her resilience. They handed her casseroles, shook her hand, patted her back. Not one of them suspected they were feeding not a grieving widow, but a predator. This is the oldest pattern in history. The wolf dresses as the shepherd, and the sheep never see it coming. Velma understood that perfectly. She knew appearances were armor, and she wore hers with saintly precision. But is the forbidden truth, the piece you weren't meant to see. Killers like Velma are not anomalies. They are reflections. Reflections of a society that worships appearances more than truth. Reflections of a system where institutions, church, medicine, law, are too fragile or too blind to question what seems normal. Velma was not just a murderer. She was a mirror, held up to the face of a community that never wanted to believe evil could live next door. And as we go deeper, as you follow me further into this descent, you'll see that Velma's story is not just about a woman with rat poison. It's about the machinery of trust itself, how it's built, how it's manipulated, and how it destroys those who never think to question it. So lean closer, because we are only at the threshold. What waits beyond is darker, heavier, and far more revealing than you expect. Velma Barfield is not just history. She's a warning. And her shadow is much larger than one small town in North Carolina. By 1970, the widow's black veil had already served its purpose. Velma's tears had dried, but her appetite for control had only begun to grow. With her first husband's ashes still lingering in memory, she quickly found herself in the company of another man, Jennings Barfield, a respected landowner and widower. To the outside world, this was a story of healing, of two wounded souls mending each other. But for Velma, it was an opportunity, one she seized with the precision of a predator closing in on wounded prey. Jennings was a man of standing, someone the community trusted. He had land, property, influence. He also had something Velma needed desperately: stability. She pursued him with calculated charm, appearing at his side in church pews, offering to help with household chores, weaving herself into his life until he could hardly imagine it without her. Neighbors saw devotion. They whispered about how quickly she moved on, but none dared to accuse her of anything more sinister than loneliness. In truth, she had already mastered her greatest weapon, blending her hunger for power into the fabric of ordinary life. Their marriage was not built on love. It was built on Velma's talent for manipulation. She cooked, cleaned, and prayed like the perfect Christian wife, but behind that smile, her secret appetites deepened. Prescription pills, Valium, Librium, Seconal. One by one, they began stacking inside her bloodstream, blurring the edges of reality while sharpening something darker inside her. These drugs became both her comfort and her curse. They numbed her pain, yet they demanded more money, more lies, more risk. Jennings began to notice missing funds, checks that didn't align, signatures that looked suspiciously like his own. Velma had become a thief in her own household, and theft, like murder, is not just about the thing taken, it's about power. She was testing bound, Aries, probing how far she could bend reality before it snapped. Jennings confronted her, and in that confrontation, Velma saw the same wall she had faced with Thomas, a man who could expose her, a man who could strip away her fragile facade. For Velma, exposure was death. And so the solution presented itself again, the same way it had the first time: poison. Rat poison, the cheapest, most untraceable weapon in rural America, arsenic hidden in food and drink. Jennings began to waste away, stomach cramps, vomiting, weakness. To the outside world it looked like illness. To the church it looked like a trial from God. To Velma it was liberation dressed as tragedy. Jennings died in 1971, less than 2 years after their wedding. Once again, Velma played her role flawlessly, the grieving widow, cloaked in loss, receiving casseroles and sympathy while quietly pocketing her freedom. But here's what you need to see beneath the surface. Every successful kill was not just a crime, it was a confirmation. Each death whispered to Velma, "You are untouchable." The community never questioned her. The doctors signed their papers. The church prayed. The system itself, the very institutions meant to protect life, cleared the path for her to kill again. And in that, we glimpse the forbidden truth. Evil doesn't thrive in chaos. Evil thrives in order. It thrives in systems that are too rigid to recognize deception when it wears a familiar smile. By the time Jennings was buried, Velma's pattern was carved into stone: manipulation, theft, poison, grief, repeat. She had discovered a formula that worked, and once a formula works, it becomes almost impossible to abandon. Her addictions deepened, her debts mounted, and so did her body count. Neighbors whispered about Velma's bad luck, husbands dying, tragedies piling up, but whispers never grew into accusations. Why? Because the archetype of the year, grandmother, the praying Christian woman, was untouchable. No one wanted to believe that such a figure could wield death like a scalpel. But Velma believed it. She embraced it. And every funeral she attended was not just the burial of her victim, it was the burial of suspicion. She had turned murder into theater, and the audience applauded her every act. What does this mean for you, sitting here listening? It means that evil rarely looks like the monster you expect. It wears faces you trust. It hides behind the roles you've been taught are sacred: mother, grandmother, priest, doctor. Velma's killings were not simply about money or addiction. They were about the intoxication of invisibility, the thrill of playing God in a world too blind to see it. And this is where the rabbit hole begins to twist darker, because once you understand how Velma operated, you begin to see the larger pattern, the institutions that protect killers by refusing to see them, the lies societies tell themselves to preserve their illusions. Velma Barfield is not a horror story locked in the past. She is a living parable about trust itself. And trust, my friend, is the most dangerous poison of all. By the early 1970s, Velma Barfield had already written the script. A grieving widow, cloaked in prayer, shrouded in sympathy, untouchable in the eyes of her neighbors, 2 husbands gone, 2 funerals performed, and not a whisper of suspicion that pointed directly at her. But killers rarely stop when they discover how easy it is to kill, and Velma, sweet, soft-spoken, grandmotherly Velma, was about to prove that once death becomes a tool, it will always demand to be used again. Her addictions were mounting. Prescription pills devoured her savings, forging checks became routine, and the hunger for more never ceased. But financial desperation was only part of it. There was something else driving her now, a thrill, a secret rush in watching the world fold itself around her lies. Velma had discovered a kind of control most people only dream of, the power to decide who lived and who died, all while everyone around her praised her kindness. That is a power more intoxicating than any drug. Her next victims would not be husbands, but those closest to her, family, neighbors, the very people who welcomed her into their homes with trust. Velma knew the perfect disguise, caretaking. To be a caregiver is to be given access, privacy, and above all, unquestioned trust, and she weaponized it like a professional assassin. Take Dolly Edwards, for example, an elderly woman Velma had befriended, cared for, and visited regularly. When Dolly began suffering the familiar symptoms, nausea, vomiting, unbearable stomach pain, neighbors saw nothing unusual. Old age brings sickness, illness brings death. That was the logic, and Velma hid inside it. Dolly's slow, excruciating death was signed away by a doctor as natural causes. Velma attended the funeral with her Bible in hand, tears on her cheeks, and nobody saw the shadow behind her eyes. But the truth is, Velma wasn't just killing. She was practiced. Icing, refining her technique, rat poison carefully measured, doses given not all at once but in waves, just enough to sicken, weaken and terrify before the final dose finished the job. To her, it was an art form, a performance, a ritual cloaked in domestic routine. Soon after, Velma's own mother, Lillian, would suffer the same fate. Yes, her mother. That's how far the spiral had taken her. When you poison your own blood, you cross a line that few ever dare to cross. But Velma did it without hesitation. Lillian's death was explained away as natural, another quiet tragedy in a poor Carolina town. And again, Velma played her role as the grieving daughter, Bible pressed against her chest, voice cracking with faith-filled sorrow. Now pause and realize what this means. The institutions, the church, the family, the doctors, the law, had all failed. They did not fail because they were weak. They failed because they could not imagine a woman like Velma existing at all. They could not imagine that kindness could kill, that a grandmother could be a predator. And so, evil thrived. This is the secret society nobody talks about, not a group of elites meeting in dark chambers, but something simpler, more terrifying. The society of appearances, a system where people believe what they want to believe, even when the truth screams beneath the surface. Velma used this system flawlessly. She understood that people will forgive almost anything if the mask looks holy enough. But you and I, we don't get to look away. We don't get to tell ourselves the comfortable lie. We have to face the pattern head on, because Velma's story is not just about a grandmother with poison. It's about the danger of unchallenged trust. And once you see it here, you'll start seeing it everywhere. Politics, media, religion, family, everywhere. Velma didn't just poison food. She poisoned perception itself. She made her victims suffer in silence, but she also made her community complicit in their deaths. They excused her. They praised her. They believed in her image. And that is the deepest kind of control, when you can kill in plain sight and no one even thinks to suspect you. This, my friend, is where the descent grows darker, Because Velma's killings were not accidents, not crimes of passion. They were methodical, deliberate, and executed with the confidence of someone who knew she was invisible. That's what makes her story dangerous. That's why you're still listening, because some part of you knows this isn't just history, it's a reflection of the world you live in right now. And we are only just beginning to pull back the veil. By the mid-1970s, Velma had perfected her mask. She was the grieving widow, the dutiful daughter, the selfless caregiver. In her community, she was trusted almost beyond question. But trust is currency, and Velma was spending it like a gambler who thinks the house can never catch her. With every death, she grew bolder. With every funeral, she grew richer. But with every lie, the threads of her mask began to fray. Addiction drove her deeper into theft. Forged checks, stolen money, fabricated stories about medical bills. Velma's financial world was a web of deceit. She knew she couldn't maintain the illusion forever. Someone would eventually notice. And when people began to notice, Velma reached for the same solution she always had: poison. Jennings Barfield's death had given her the first taste of financial gain through murder. But it was only the beginning. When suspicions arose, when debts threatened to drag her into exposure, the people closest to her conveniently fell ill. Neighbors whispered that Velma had terrible luck, that everyone around her seemed cursed, but they never said it loud enough to matter. The church prayed for her. The doctors signed death certificates without question, and Velma moved through the wreckage, her Bible always in hand, her voice always trembling with faith. But underneath her saintly disguise, Velma had become something far darker, a predator who fed on the very people who trusted her most. Elderly neighbors, her own mother, even men she dated. She selected them like pieces on a chessboard, moving them into position before delivering the final invisible strike. Rat poison in food, arsenic in tea. The symptoms always looked the same: nausea, cramps, diarrhea, collapse. And always, Velma was there, comforting, praying, weeping. No one ever imagined the comforter was the executioner. Her control seemed absolute, but cracks were forming. The deaths were too many, the timing too convenient. And then came Stuart Taylor, a man who would not only become Velma's victim, but the reason her empire of lies collapsed. Stuart was 56 years old, a widower who had begun dating Velma. To him she seemed kind, gentle, reliable, the perfect partner in his later years. But as with all her relationships, Velma's charm was a mask covering desperation. Her debts were mounting, her drug dependency spiraling out of control. She forged checks in Stuart's name, draining his accounts to feed her addiction. And when he confronted her, when the financial noose tightened, Velma reached once again for her favorite solution. The poison took its course during a Pentecostal revival meeting in 1978. Stuart collapsed, his body racked with pain, his stomach tearing itself apart from the inside. This time, however, something shifted. His family, unlike the others, did not accept the death as God's will. They demanded answers. They demanded an autopsy. And for the first time, the curtain of faith and appearances that Velma had hidden behind was pulled back. The autopsy revealed arsenic. The truth spilled out like poison itself, seeping into every corner of her carefully constructed life. Investigators uncovered the pattern, the insurance money, the forged checks, the trail of bodies stretching back nearly a decade. The grandmother with the Bible in her lap was exposed as one of America's most calculating serial killers. But understand this: Velma was not merely a killer of individuals, she was a killer of illusions. Her story forces us to face the uncomfortable reality that appearances are worthless, that faith can be weaponized, that evil thrives not in shadows, but in plain sight. She did not lurk in dark alleys. She sat in church pews. She cooked dinners. She prayed for the dying, while slipping them the poison that killed them. And here is where the descent deepens, because Velma's story is not just about her crimes, it's about the system that enabled her, a system where doctors didn't question, where churches sanctified her image, where law enforcement failed to connect the dots. Evil does not flourish alone, it flourishes in the cracks of institutions too fragile to see the truth. So let me ask you directly, how many Velmas still walk among us today? How many faces smile at you while hiding knives behind their backs? That's the forbidden question. That's why this story matters. We've peeled back one layer of her mask, but there are many more, and the deeper we go, the more you'll see how her story is not just about murder, it's about the hidden systems of manipulation that surround you every single day. When the poison was finally uncovered in Stuart Taylor's body, Velma's mask shattered. For nearly a decade, she had played the roles of widow, daughter, neighbor, caregiver, churchwoman. But in 1978, investigators pulled those masks away piece by piece until what was left was something the community could barely comprehend. The grandmother with folded hands had been feeding arsenic to the people who trusted her most. The autopsy was undeniable. The cover was gone. The police dug deeper. They exhumed other bodies. They connected her forged checks, her drug use, her sudden financial windfalls with the trail of death that followed her. One by one, the coincidences unraveled. The woman who sat in church praying for salvation was revealed as a serial predator who had used trust itself as her camouflage. At her trial, the courtroom was heavy with disbelief. Some neighbors refused to accept it. Some cried openly, saying, "Velma couldn't have done this. She was too kind, too loving." That is the power of appearances. Even when faced with evidence, people resist believing that evil could wear such a familiar face. But the evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses described her patterns, doctors described the poison, forensic tests revealed arsenic where there should have been none. Velma's fate was sealed. And yet, this is where the story bends darker. Because instead of fighting the charges, instead of pleading innocence to the very end, Velma confessed. Not to one death, not to two, but to multiple murders. She admitted it calmly, without theatrics. She had poisoned those who trusted her, and she did it because it solved her problems, because it brought her relief, because it gave her control. Think about what that means. She was not insane. She was not driven by rage in the heat of the moment. She was deliberate, methodical, calculated. She did it because it worked. And in her confession, we glimpse the most disturbing truth. Evil often doesn't look monstrous at all. It looks rational. It looks practical. It looks ordinary. The court sentenced her to death. In 1984, Velma Barfield became the first woman in the United States to be executed by lethal injection, a grandmotherly figure strapped to a gurney, receiving the very thing she had given others, poison in the veins. Reporters described the scene as haunting. Some called it justice, others called it a tragedy. But the real tragedy was not Velma's death. It was the countless blind eyes turned during her life. Because here's the forbidden truth. Velma didn't act alone. She had accomplices. Not in the form of fellow killers, but in the form of institutions that refused to see her, doctors who signed false causes of death, neighbors who ignored the strange coincidences, churches that sanctified her image without question. Even her victims played a part, not because they wanted to, but because they trusted her. That is the cruelest part of all. She didn't kill strangers. She killed those who loved her. And here's where this story transcends history and enters your life. You've been taught to trust certain faces, certain titles, certain roles. You've been conditioned to believe that a grandmother is harmless, that a pastor is holy, that a doctor is always right, that a system will protect you. Velma proves otherwise. She proves that trust is not protection, it is vulnerability. And those who understand how to weaponize it can walk through life invisible, unstoppable, untouchable. That's why her story matters. Not just because she was the first woman executed by lethal injection, not just because she killed with rat poison, but because she is the mirror of something larger, something older than America itself, the mask of innocence, the weaponization of trust, the manipulation of systems that are too fragile to see. When Velma was executed, many believed the story ended there, that justice had been served, that the evil was gone. But evil does not die with the execution of one woman. Evil is a pattern, a structure, a method. Velma simply revealed it in one of its purest forms. And so the question remains, how many more Velmas still exist, hidden behind familiar faces, feeding poison into the veins of families, institutions, and nations? That is what we must confront. That is the descent we are only beginning to take. By now you've seen Velma Barfield for who she was. Not a sweet grandmother, not a tragic widow, but a predator who used trust as her weapon and faith as her camouflage. But if you stop there, if you tell yourself this was just one woman, one town, one strange story from the 1970s, you've missed the point entirely. Velma is not just a figure in history, she is a blueprint. Think about what made her so successful. She wasn't the smartest person in the room. She didn't have wealth or power or political influence. She didn't need brute force or weapons. All she had was the ability to read what people wanted to believe and then give it to them. That's it. That's her entire method. Appear kind, appear helpless, appear faithful, appear trustworthy. Once people bought the image, she could poison them in broad daylight and no one dared to question her. Now pause. Really pause. Does that sound familiar? It should, because Velma's method is the same method used every single day by politicians who smile while selling you lies, by corporations that brand themselves as family-friendly while draining your pockets dry, by leaders who wrap themselves in flags or religion or polished words while quietly tightening their grip on you. Velma was a small-town example of a universal truth. People don't believe reality. They believe appearances. They believe the story. And once someone controls the story, they can control everything else, your money, your choices, even your life. That is why her case matters. That is why you cannot look away. Velma's victims died not only because she poisoned them, but because they trusted her. They let the image blind them to the reality. And that is the forbidden lesson. Trust, when misplaced, is more dangerous than arsenic, because arsenic can only kill the body, but trust, weaponized, can kill entire societies. So here is the real descent. Oh, it's not into Velma's crimes or her courtroom confessions or her execution. It's into the mirror, into the world you live in right now, into the quiet recognition that every day you are surrounded by masks. Some of them protect you, some of them entertain you, but some of them, just like Velma's, are hiding poison. The question is not whether Velma Barfield still exists. The question is, how many of her are around you right now, smiling, praying, reassuring, while slowly tightening their grip? And the even darker question is, how would you know? Because the most dangerous killer is never the one in the shadows. It's the one sitting right across the table, passing you a plate of food, looking you in the eye, and telling you exactly what you want to hear. That's the secret society nobody talks about. That's the forbidden truth Velma Barfield forces us to confront. And now that you've seen it, you can never unsee it. By 1971, Velma Barfield had buried one husband. Thomas Burke, her first, had wasted away under mysterious illness until his body gave out. Neighbors pitied her, whispered prayers in church, shook their heads at her hard luck. A grieving widow, left alone with children, in a small Carolina town. That was the image Velma carried. But behind the mask, something darker had already taken root. Addiction, financial deceit, and the taste of control she discovered when a man's life ended in her care. It didn't take long for another man to step into her life. His name was Jennings Barfield, older, stable, offering her a second chance at a respectable marriage. For Velma, Jennings was more than a husband. He was a shield. Marrying him helped her preserve the mask of a church-going, Bible-carrying, God-fearing woman. To the world she seemed redeemed, a mother who had survived tragedy, now given another shot at happiness. But the truth, Jennings was never a partner to Velma. He was a financial solution, a cover story, a man already marked from the beginning. Jennings trusted her, he believed her devotion, and in the early days of their marriage he had no reason to doubt. But behind closed doors, Velma's addictions worsened. Pills for anxiety, pills for pain, pills she stole, manipulated doctors for, or bought with money she didn't have. And when debts began to pile up, Jennings became less a husband and more a liability. Velma's mask of innocence was cracking. People were starting to notice the forged checks, the constant borrowing. Jennings, in his quiet way, questioned her, and to Velma, that meant one thing: danger. It was around this time that Jennings began to fall ill. At first it seemed like nothing: stomach pains, nausea, fatigue. Velma, always the attentive wife, cooked for him, prayed over him, and nursed him through his sickness. To neighbors and family, her devotion looked saintly. They saw a woman who had already lost one husband, now tending day and night to her second, desperate not to lose him too. But the truth was the exact opposite. Every meal Velma prepared was laced with death. Jennings's body weakened day by day. His stomach tore itself apart. His organs shut down slowly, painfully, in a way that seemed inexplicable to doctors. No one suspected Velma. Why would they? She was the one caring for him. She was the one crying at his bedside. She was the one quoting scripture, folding her hands in prayer, asking God for mercy. And when Jennings finally died, Velma did what she always did. She performed grief like an actress. Tears for the neighbors, sobs for the church pews, quiet dignity when the funeral was done. But here's the haunting detail. Jennings Barfield's death wasn't questioned. The doctors signed the certificate. The community shook their heads and said Velma must be cursed. Another husband gone, poor Velma. Tragedy just seemed to follow her, and she leaned into that role, the cursed widow, the faithful sufferer. The mask tightened, the poison disappeared into the grave. What Jennings didn't know, what no one yet realized, was that his death wasn't an accident of fate. It was practice. Velma had discovered her perfect weapon. No knives, no guns, nothing messy, just a pinch of arsenic in food or drink. The symptoms mimicked natural illness. The victim lingered long enough for her to look like a saint at their bedside. And when it was over, she was left standing, innocent, surrounded by sympathy. Jennings Barfield was not just another victim. He was the proof of concept. The moment Velma learned she could kill openly, in plain sight, and walk away untouched. From this point forward, death followed Velma wherever she went. And yet no one suspected. No one asked questions, because her disguise, the God-fearing woman, was too perfect. Jennings's grave closed, but for Velma, a door had opened. After Jennings Barfield's death, Velma's role as the grieving widow solidified. People in her community shook their heads with pity. How much more tragedy can one woman endure? That was the story they told themselves, and Velma let them believe it. She leaned on the sympathy, on the casseroles left at her door, on the prayers whispered in her church pew. But behind that mask of sorrow, Velma wasn't cursed. She was calculating. Jennings's death had taught her something no one else suspected. She had discovered the perfect crime. Poison was her secret weapon, and it was flawless. No struggle, no noise, no blood, no suspicion, just a slow, creeping sickness that looked like nature itself was to blame. With arsenic, Velma could kill anyone, and no one would ever think it was her. And the beauty of it? Poison gave her time. Unlike a gunshot or a stabbing, arsenic stretched death across days, sometimes weeks. While her victims withered away, Velma got to play the part of angel and martyr. She was the hand that cooked their food, the mouth that prayed over their suffering, the tearful face at their bedside. When death came, she didn't look guilty, she looked holy. This duality, the predator and the saint, was the engine of her power. Velma had learned that she didn't need to hide from suspicion, she just needed to control it. By appearing as the last person anyone would suspect, she was untouchable. Neighbors and family began to notice a strange coincidence. People around Velma seemed to die. Husbands, relatives, even friends. But instead of sparking alarm, it reinforced her cover. Poor Velma, they thought. Death just follows her. Sympathy blinded them to the truth. They didn't see the common thread because the common thread was Velma herself, and Velma was too skilled at directing their emotions away from her. With Jennings gone, Velma's financial troubles returned. Addiction gnawed at her, pills consumed her paychecks, forgery and theft filled the gaps, but poison gave her an answer. It became her invisible eraser, a way to silence anyone who questioned her, anyone who threatened to expose her lies, anyone who got in the way of her drug-fueled survival. Velma didn't kill in a frenzy. She killed like an accountant balancing books, coldly, methodically. Each death solved a problem. Each coffin bought her more time, and each successful poisoning reinforced her confidence that she was invincible. This is where her story takes its most disturbing turn. Killing became routine. She began to see it not as extraordinary, but as practical. The line between life and death for Velma blurred into convenience. If someone was a burden, if they threatened her, if they cost her money, she already knew the solution. A pinch of powder, a plate of food, a quiet prayer. Then wait. The pattern repeated itself with chilling precision. Illness, decline, devoted caregiving, death, mourning, sympathy, survival. Each cycle was a rehearsal for the next, and each time Velma walked away clean, her confidence deepened. It's important to understand something here. Velma was not an impulsive killer. She was not driven by rage, nor did she lose control. She was deliberate. She was patient. She could wait days, weeks, even months, watching her victims suffer, knowing the outcome was inevitable. That kind of patience is not human in the ordinary sense. It's predatory. It's the kind of patience spiders have, waiting in webs. By the mid-1970s, Velma Barfield had mastered her disguise. To the outside world, she was still a grandmother, still a churchwoman, still a victim of cruel fate. But in the shadows, she was something else entirely, a serial killer who had perfected the art of killing without being seen. And the most terrifying part, nobody around her suspected. Nobody asked the obvious questions, because who would ever believe that a woman with folded hands and whispered prayers was feeding poison to the people who trusted her most? Velma didn't just kill with arsenic. She killed with the mask of innocence, and by now, she knew exactly how to wear it. By the mid-1970s, Velma Barfield had learned the cruelest trick of all. The deadliest disguise is service. If she wanted access to the vulnerable, if she wanted control over life and death, all she had to do was offer help, and nothing gave her greater access than the role of caretaker. To outsiders, this seemed natural. Velma had always been the kind of woman who volunteered, who cooked meals for the sick, who checked in on the elderly. Her Bible in one hand, medicine bottles in the other, a godsend for neighbors too frail to look after themselves. The church praised her, families trusted her, and one by one they invited her into their homes, never realizing that they were opening the door to their own destruction. Velma knew exactly what she was doing. As a caretaker, she was in control of everything, the food, the medicine, the daily routine. Vulnerable people relied on her, and their families thanked her for it. But under the guise of Christian charity, Velma held the power of death in her kitchen cabinets. The same woman who bowed her head in prayer before meals was stirring arsenic into the very food she blessed. The brilliance of her mask was in its simplicity. Who would suspect a woman feeding and bathing the sick of being the one killing them? Who would question the widow who sang hymns in church, then spoon-fed poison to the weak? No one. And that's exactly why the role of caretaker became her perfect hunting ground. Velma began to widen her circle of victims. No longer limited to husbands, she now targeted those she was helping. If they grew suspicious, if they questioned her theft, if they became too much of a burden, the solution was the same, a quiet dose of arsenic. The body would weaken, the family would sigh that it was old, or bad luck, and Velma would once again be the grieving presence at the funeral. Every new death seemed to reinforce her reputation as a saint. Her willingness to sit by the dying, to comfort them, to tend to their needs, it elevated her in the eyes of her church and community. She was no longer just the unfortunate widow who had lost 2 husbands. She was seen as a woman of faith, enduring tragedy, yet still serving others. The irony is grotesque. The very thing that made people praise her was the very thing that killed them. But Velma wasn't just killing for convenience anymore. By this stage, her addiction to drugs and her constant money problems intertwined with her killings. She stole checks from those she cared for, forged signatures, drained accounts. And when someone got too close to noticing, the illness began. The pattern repeated, poison as the final silencer. This cycle, the trap of trust, followed by betrayal, became the defining feature of her crimes. Velma wasn't breaking into homes with violence. She wasn't hunting strangers on dark streets. She was sitting at kitchen tables, bowing her head in prayer, feeding the very people who believed she was there to save them. Her weapon wasn't just arsenic. It was the human instinct to trust someone who looks kind, speaks softly, and shows up when no one else will. The caretaker's trap is what makes Velma Barfield one of the most unsettling killers in American history. She didn't need to stalk or chase. Her victims came to her willingly. They invited her in. They trusted her with their lives. And that trust became the poison she poured into their veins, drop by drop, until it killed them. By the time her victims were buried, Velma's reputation as a godly, selfless woman only grew stronger. The trap was complete. She was the angel of mercy on the outside, and the angel of death on the inside. And the next name to fall into her web of poisoned prayers was Dolly Edwards. By the late 1970s, Velma Barfield's mask was perfected. The widow, the churchgoer, the caretaker who always seemed to appear when someone was in need. That mask opened doors, and once inside, Velma didn't just help. She decided who lived and who died. One of the next names to fall into her path was Dolly Edwards, an elderly neighbor. Dolly lived alone, her health already fragile, and like so many others in small southern towns, she trusted Velma completely. Why wouldn't she? Velma was kind. Velma was helpful. Velma was the woman who showed up with a casserole dish in one hand and a Bible in the other. If anyone seemed safe, it was her. Velma quickly positioned herself as Dolly's helper. She checked in, brought meals, managed errands. To outsiders, it looked like pure charity. But Velma wasn't motivated by kindness. She had already been dipping into Dolly's finances, writing checks in her name and forging her signature. Dolly wasn't just a lonely neighbor to Velma, she was a resource. And when that resource began to slip out of Velma's control, when there was a chance Dolly might notice the missing money, Velma's solution was the same one she always reached for: poison. It began quietly. Dolly complained of stomach pains. She felt weak, nauseated, and dizzy. At first, there was no reason to suspect foul play. She was elderly. Illness was part of life at her age. Neighbors shook their heads sympathetically. Poor Dolly, they said. Her health's been failing. And right there at her bedside, spoon in hand, sat Velma, devoted, prayerful, ever-present. But the truth was far more sinister. Velma was not fighting Dolly's illness, she was causing it. Each visit brought another dose. Each meal Velma served, each drink she poured, carried with it a silent killer that tore Dolly apart from the inside. The beauty of Velma's method, if you can call it beauty, was that Ollie's suffering seemed natural. Arsenic mimics the body's own betrayals: vomiting, diarrhea, dehydration, organ failure. To a doctor, it looked like heart trouble or complications from age. To neighbors, it looked like a cruel twist of fate. But to Velma, it was perfect. She sat close, held Dolly's hand, and whispered prayers while her body was being destroyed by Velma's own design. And when Dolly finally succumbed, the script was already written. Velma wept. She spoke in soft tones about how she had done all she could. She quoted scripture. She attended the funeral with folded hands and downcast eyes, the image of a faithful servant mourning yet another death. Once again, the community rallied around her. Velma is cursed, they murmured. Death just seems to follow her. No one asked the obvious question: why did so many people tied to Velma die in the same slow, agonizing way? No one dared suspect that the woman baking pies for church socials was also stirring arsenic into the food of those she cared for. For Velma, Dolly Edwards' death was more than just another tragedy to perform grief over. It was proof that her method still worked flawlessly. She had silenced another voice, erased another debt, and walked away clean. Dolly was gone. The forged checks would never be questioned. The financial trail was buried with the body. But the most chilling part of Dolly Edwards' death isn't the poisoning itself. It's the way Velma turned it into a stage performance. To everyone watching, Velma was mercy embodied, tending the sick, praying over the dying. They believed her, they praised her, they loved her for it, and that praise only made her hungrier. Dolly's death didn't satisfy Velma. It emboldened her. It reminded her of the power she held over life and death. And if she could poison a friend and neighbor without anyone suspecting, then what line was left? Who was safe? The answer was chilling. No one, not even her own family. Because the next target Velma turned her attention to was her own mother. If the story of Velma Barfield weren't already steeped in tragedy and horror, this next chapter takes it to an even darker place. Because it wasn't enough for Velma to poison neighbors, friends, and husbands. No. Eventually her sights fell on the one person who should have been untouchable, the one bond that even killers usually refuse to cross. Her own mother. Lillian Bullard was an elderly woman, worn down by age but still carrying the kind of trust only a mother can give her daughter. Velma had been living with her on and off, often turning to her for stability when her life spiraled into chaos. And as always, the community believed Velma was a dutiful daughter, caring for her mother with patience and love. They didn't see the hidden motives simmering beneath that facade. For Velma, money was always the root. Her drug addiction had grown worse, and her ability to keep up with bills collapsed under the weight of her forgery and theft. Each time she reached into her mother's purse or manipulated her accounts, she was gambling with exposure. Lillian was no fool. If she discovered what Velma was doing, the trust would shatter, and Velma's safety net would be gone. Velma couldn't allow that, and by now, she already knew the answer. Arsenic. It started the same way it always did. Small doses, hidden in food or drink, a slow erosion of health that looked like natural decline. Lillian began complaining of stomach pain, weakness, exhaustion. Doctors nodded and sighed. What could you expect from an elderly woman? They prescribed comfort, rest, prayer, and Velma was right there, hovering like the model daughter, spooning out medicine, cooking meals, whispering prayers as though she were heaven sent. But behind that mask of devotion, Velma was orchestrating her mother's destruction. Every bite of food was a weapon. Every sip of tea carried death in disguise. And as her mother's condition worsened, Velma leaned deeper into the performance of the faithful caretaker. She prayed louder. She cried harder. She spoke of how much she loved her mama. To the outside world, it was heartbreaking. A daughter watching her mother waste away, a Christian woman suffering yet another cruel twist of fate. Neighbors pitied her. The church wrapped her in sympathy. Nobody dared to imagine that the grief-stricken daughter at the bedside was the executioner. When Lillian finally passed, Velma did what she always did. She wept, she prayed, she received condolences, and she walked away free. Once again, the poison had done its job perfectly. The death certificate didn't point to murder. The whispers in town didn't point to Velma. If anything, her reputation as a woman cursed by loss only grew stronger. But this time was different. Killing a neighbor or a husband was one thing. Killing her own mother was another. It stripped away any illusion that Velma had boundaries. It revealed the full depth of her detachment, her ability to wear the mask so tightly that even her own flesh and blood became just another obstacle to eliminate. And yet, perhaps most chilling of all, Velma didn't stop. There was no moment of reckoning, no hesitation, no guilt so strong it made her change course. Poison had become too easy, too reliable, too perfect a solution. Each successful death reinforced her belief that she was untouchable. Her mother was gone, the financial risk erased, the mask still intact, and Velma still walked among her neighbors and church friends as the image of Christian virtue. What no one realized, not yet, was that the mask was beginning to crack. The pattern was becoming too visible, the coincidences too frequent, and Velma's greed too reckless. The bodies were piling up, and eventually someone would have to ask the forbidden question, why do so many people around Velma Barfield end up dead? For years, Velma Barfield had lived behind her mask. The grieving widow, the faithful churchgoer, the dutiful caretaker. She had convinced everyone that death simply followed her, like some curse she could never escape. And it worked. Time after time, she walked away from poisoned corpses without suspicion. But no mask, no matter how carefully worn, can remain perfect forever. By the late 1970s, Velma's pattern was beginning to strain under its own weight. Too many funerals, too many illnesses that followed the same script, sudden stomach pains, violent vomiting, diarrhea, dehydration, and then death. In isolation, these tragedies seemed ordinary. Taken together, they formed a chilling mosaic. And while most people still pitied Velma, small whispers had started to rise beneath the surface. Why does it always happen around her? Velma, of course, brushed those whispers aside with prayer and performance. She leaned harder into her role. She wept louder at funerals, clutched her Bible tighter, and folded her hands longer in prayer. But the truth was, The mask was slipping, not because she was becoming careless with her poisons, but because her desperation was growing. Her addiction was now in control. Pills consumed her life, money was always short, and theft had become routine. Checks stolen, signatures forged, savings drained. Each time she dipped into someone's finances, the risk of being caught loomed larger, and when that risk grew too close, Velma's solution never changed: arsenic. But poison had a side effect she could not control. It left a trail. Not a visible one, not yet, but a trail nonetheless. Family members began to notice the odd timing of Velma's visits. Doctors puzzled at the similarities between deaths that shouldn't have been connected, and investigators, though not yet closing in, were slowly beginning to see a pattern forming in the shadows. The cracks were appearing in other ways too. Velma's grief, once convincing, sometimes came across as exaggerated. Her wails too loud, her prayers too practiced, her tears too sudden. Those closest to her started to notice the performance, even if they couldn't put their finger on why it felt wrong. And then there was her behavior around money. The forgeries were stacking up. Bank accounts drained in the wake of a death. Velma would tell stories, make excuses, insist that her actions were misunderstood, but suspicion was seeping through the edges. The truth is, Velma was addicted not just to pills, but to the feeling of control. Each poisoning gave her power over life and death. Each performance of grief gave her power over her community. But addictions always escalate, and in Velma's case, the killings became more frequent, the financial crimes more reckless, the cover-ups thinner. By now, Velma had crossed every moral boundary: husbands, neighbors, her own mother. She had proven to herself that no one was sacred, no one was safe, and yet she still believed she could not be caught. That belief was her greatest weapon and her greatest weakness. Because the cracks in her mask were no longer invisible, they were small, yes, but widening. And once a mask begins to crack, it cannot be repaired. The stage was being set for Velma's downfall, not by sudden discovery, not by a single mistake, but by the accumulation of suspicion, the quiet unease of those who had once trusted her. Velma Barfield, the praying widow, the caretaker, the grieving daughter, had built a life on arsenic and lies. But death leaves a pattern, and soon that pattern would draw the eyes of investigators who were no longer willing to dismiss her tragedies as bad luck. The cracks in the mask were spreading, and through those cracks the world was about to see the real Velma Barfield, not T, he angel of mercy, but the angel of death. By the late 1970s, Velma Barfield had already left a trail of poisoned bodies in her wake, husbands, neighbors, even her own mother, and yet she still moved freely among her community, still wrapped in the image of a woman of faith. But it was her relationship with Stuart Taylor that would set into motion the chain of events leading to her downfall. Stuart Taylor was a widower, a simple man with a steady routine. Lonely, aging, and seeking companionship, he seemed like the perfect partner for Velma. To those who knew them, their relationship looked almost ordinary, two people both touched by loss, finding comfort in one another. But as always with Velma, what appeared ordinary was anything but. From the beginning, Velma's intentions were clouded by desperation. Her addiction to prescription drugs was tightening its grip. She needed money constantly, and her methods of obtaining it had grown reckless. Forged checks, stolen funds, lies stacked on lies, and Stuart, kind, trusting Stuart, became her next financial target. Velma began writing checks in Stuart's name, forging his signature with the same practiced hand she had used on her other victims. At first, the theft went unnoticed, but Stuart was not as oblivious as others had been. He started to notice discrepancies, missing money, checks he couldn't remember signing. The cracks in Velma's mask, already widening, were now visible to the very man who shared her bed. And for Velma, suspicion was a death sentence. She had silenced every other risk before, and Stuart would be no different. The plan unfolded in the same way it always had. Meals prepared, drinks served, each laced with poison. Slowly his body began to fail. At first it was dismissed as illness, but soon the sickness grew unmistakable: violent nausea, stomach pain, relentless vomiting. Stuart's health declined rapidly, leaving friends and neighbors Oars deeply concerned. Velma, of course, played her part. She hovered at his bedside, offered prayers, spoke with the gentle voice of a devoted companion. To outsiders, she was once again the angel of mercy, tending to yet another loved one who had fallen victim to fate's cruelty. But in truth, she was tightening the noose, making sure Stuart would never confront her about the missing money, never expose her lies, never reveal the truth. Stuart's final days were agonizing. The poison coursed through his body, stripping him of strength, robbing him of life piece by piece, and all the while Velma maintained her mask. She cried, she prayed, she whispered scripture, as though her words could heal what her own hands had destroyed. When Stuart Taylor died, Velma believed she had succeeded again, another death dismissed as natural, another tragedy she could weave into her tale of endless suffering. But this time, the mask could not hold. The suspicion was too great. Stuart had voiced concerns before his death, had spoken of the forged checks, had left behind whispers that others remembered, and the similarity of his illness to those who had died around Velma could no longer be ignored. Stuart Taylor's fate was sealed the moment he noticed the theft, but what Velma didn't realize was that her fate was sealed with his. His death would not vanish into silence like the others. It would become the thread investigators pulled, unraveling her entire web of lies and poison. In killing Stuart Taylor, Velma believed she was protecting herself. In reality, she had just written the opening chapter of her own downfall. Stuart Taylor's death should have been just another entry in Velma Barfield's long line of tragic losses. That was her expectation. A few tears, a few prayers, and the town would rally around her once more, convinced that fate had dealt her yet another cruel blow. But this time, the story didn't end with condolences. This time, the cracks in her mask were too large to ignore. Stuart's illness had been violent, brutal, and strangely familiar. Friends who had seen other people close to Velma die began whispering comparisons. The stomach pains, the vomiting, the sudden decline. It was all too similar. And unlike her past victims, Stuart had left behind hints, words spoken in frustration before his body gave out. He had told people he was worried about his money. He had noticed checks written in his name that he didn't remember signing. He had started to doubt the woman sitting beside him. When he died, those doubts didn't die with him. They lingered, hanging in the air like a stench too strong to ignore. Doctors, too, were uneasy. The pattern of symptoms was suspicious. The timing of Stuart's decline didn't match any clear illness, and in the backdrop of Velma's history, so many deaths, all striking those closest to her, the coincidences began to look like something far more sinister. Whispers became questions, questions became reports, and soon law enforcement stepped in. For the first time, Velma Barfield was not just a grieving widow or a dutiful caretaker. She was a suspect. The investigation began quietly but firmly. Detectives retraced Stuart's final days, speaking to neighbors, friends, and doctors. They learned of his suspicions about the forged checks. They learned of Velma's constant presence at his bedside. And they learned that the illness that had killed him bore a striking resemblance to the ones that had claimed others in Velma's orbit. Then, came the decision that would unravel everything. Stuart Taylor's body was exhumed. It was a rare move, but a necessary one. For years, Velma had relied on poison's ability to disguise itself as natural decline. But modern science was catching up. Forensic testing could reveal what the naked eye could not, and when Stuart's remains were examined, the truth emerged with devastating clarity. Arsenic, the same silent killer that had taken Dolly Edwards, the same poison that had eaten away at her own mother, the same weapon Velma had relied on for years. This time, it had left its mark too clearly to deny. For investigators, the discovery was both shocking and inevitable. Shocking, because the idea of Velma, the church-going widow, the woman everyone pitied, being a serial killer was almost unthinkable. Inevitable, because the pattern was undeniable, and Stuart's death had forced the mask to finally shatter. Velma was confronted, questioned, pressed for answers. At first, she did what she always did, cried, prayed, insisted she was innocent. But the evidence was stronger than her performance. The arsenic was real, the forged checks were real. The trail of death behind her was real. Suspicion had become certainty. The investigation had transformed Velma Barfield from a woman cloaked in sympathy to a woman facing exposure. And once investigators realized Stuart Taylor's death was no accident, they began to wonder how many others had fallen to the same fate. How many bodies would they have to dig up? How many tragedies in Velma's life were not tragedies at all, but murders carefully disguised as fate? For Velma, the performance was over. The mask had cracked beyond repair, and in its place stood the horrifying truth. A woman who had spent years poisoning those closest to her, all while hiding behind the guise of faith, grief, and care. The suspicion had turned into investigation. The investigation would soon turn into arrest, and the world was about to learn the full extent of Velma Barfield's crimes. By the time the toxicology reports came back, there was no more room for doubt. Arsenic had been the silent executioner that ended Stuart Taylor's life, and with that single discovery, the walls around Velma Barfield began to close. Detectives who once saw her as a grieving widow now saw her as a predator. Friends who once pitied her now whispered that they had been fooled. The woman who had sat at hospital bedsides and led prayers at church was no longer a symbol of faith. She was a suspect in cold-blooded murder. The authorities didn't move hastily. They wanted their case airtight. They traced Velma's history step by step, looking at the deaths that had seemed natural at the time, but now seemed suspiciously familiar. Dolly Edwards, Lillian Bullard, even the deaths of her past husbands. The pattern was grotesque but consistent. A circle of loved ones, all suffering the same horrific symptoms, all leaving Velma with either sympathy, money, or both. With each name added to the list, the picture sharpened. Velma wasn't cursed, she wasn't unlucky, she wasn't haunted by tragedy, she was creating it. Finally, the moment came. Velma Barfield was arrested in 1978. The woman who had spent years hiding behind a mask of virtue was now in handcuffs, escorted by officers through flashing cameras and a community reeling in disbelief. Neighbors watched in silence, struggling to reconcile the image of the woman they knew with the monster the investigators described. Velma didn't fight the arrest. She cried. She prayed. She clutched her Bible and spoke of her innocence. But the days of sympathy were over. The arsenic in Stuart Taylor's body was undeniable, the forged checks were undeniable, and her history of bad luck deaths could no longer be explained away as coincidence. In the interrogation room, Velma's performance continued. She wept. She insisted she was misunderstood. Odd. She begged for compassion. Yet, under pressure, pieces of the mask fell away. She admitted to forging checks, she admitted to struggling with drugs, and slowly she began to crack under the weight of the evidence pressing in around her. For investigators, it was a strange sight. Velma didn't look like a killer. She didn't act like the monster they expected. She was soft-spoken, even gentle. But behind that softness lay a chilling truth. A woman who had learned to weaponize trust, to cloak murder in tenderness, to disguise arsenic as care. Her arrest sent shockwaves through North Carolina. Newspapers exploded with headlines, church-going woman accused of murder. Communities whispered in disbelief. Families of past victims began to wonder if their loved ones had truly died of natural causes, or if Velma's gentle hands had fed them death. The arrest was not the end of Velma's story. It was only the beginning of a legal battle that would expose her crimes to the world, but it was the first time she stood before the world without the shield of sympathy, without the disguise of a grieving widow. In that moment, Velma Barfield was no longer the woman who prayed at hospital bedsides. She was the woman who put them there. The performance was over. The prayers no longer worked, and the law was ready to strip away the last remnants of her mask. The angel of death had finally been caught. By the time Velma Barfield's trial began in 1979, the entire state of North Carolina was watching. The story was irresistible to the public. A grandmotherly woman in her late 40s, a devoted churchgoer, accused of poisoning the man who trusted her most. To her neighbors, she had been the picture of piety. To prosecutors, she was the first female serial killer they had ever tried in the modern era. The courtroom was packed on the first day. Journalists lined the benches, sketch artists filled their pads, and curious citizens crowded in, eager to witness the spectacle. When Velma entered, dressed conservatively, Bible in hand, she looked nothing like the monster described in headlines, and that contrast between the image and the evidence would define the trial. The prosecution wasted no time laying out their case. They presented Stuart Taylor's story, a healthy man who suddenly fell violently ill, his symptoms escalating until death claimed him. They detailed Velma's forged checks, showing how money had flowed out of Stuart's accounts in her handwriting, and then came the most damning evidence, the toxicology reports. Scientists testified that arsenic was present in Stuart's body in lethal amounts. The same symptoms, the same poison, the same outcome. Velma was no grieving partner, they argued, but a killer who had silenced a man who threatened to expose her theft. The defense painted a different picture. They leaned heavily on Velma's long history of drug addiction, portraying her as a woman trapped by demons beyond her control. They emphasized her devotion to church, her gentle demeanor, her fragile health. She was not a murderer, they claimed, but a broken woman misunderstood by the world. Velma herself sat quietly, head bowed, occasionally wiping tears. She clutched her Bible so tightly that her knuckles whitened. To some, she appeared as a woman of fate, each under attack. To others, it was just another performance, the same act she had perfected at countless funerals. Witness after witness was called. Friends of Stuart testified about his suspicions before his death, how he had noticed checks disappearing and had voiced doubts about Velma. Medical experts described the slow, painful effects of arsenic poisoning, painting a vivid picture of how Stuart must have suffered. Financial records confirmed the theft that had pushed Velma into desperation. And then came the testimony about the pattern. The prosecution didn't stop at Stuart. They hinted at the string of other deaths surrounding Velma, neighbors, relatives, even her own mother, all succumbing to eerily similar symptoms. Though she wasn't formally charged with those murders at the time, the suggestion was clear. Stuart Taylor was not her first victim. He was simply the last. The trial became more than a legal battle. It became a battle of images. Was Velma Barfield the sweet, soft-spoken Christian grandmother, or was she a calculating killer who weaponized sympathy? Each side hammered away at the jury, trying to shape which version they would believe. The evidence, however, was relentless. The arsenic spoke louder than her tears, the forged checks spoke louder than her prayers, and the trail of bodies, whether officially admitted into evidence or whispered from the gallery, spoke louder than her fragile voice. By the end of the trial, the mask Velma had worn for so long was gone. The jury was left to decide not whether Stuart Taylor had been poisoned, that much was clear, but whether Velma Barfield, the church-going widow, was capable of committing such a crime. The answer would soon come, and it would seal Velma's place in history. The trial of Velma Barfield stretched on for weeks, each day chipping away at the fragile mask she had worn for years. By the time the lawyers delivered their closing arguments, the courtroom was heavy with tension. Reporters scribbled notes, jurors sat pale and weary, and Velma, small, frail, clutching her Bible, seemed to shrink beneath the weight of it all. The prosecution's final words were sharp and direct. They painted Velma as a cold and calculating killer, a woman who cloaked herself in faith while secretly feeding poison to those who trusted her most. They reminded the jury of Stuart Taylor's final days, the agony he endured, and the toxicology reports that proved arsenic coursed through his veins. They reminded them of the forged checks, the lies, the pattern of death that surrounded her life like shadows. She is no victim of tragedy, the prosecutor declared. She is the author of it. The defense countered with desperation. They urged the jury to see Velma as a woman broken by years of addiction, trapped in a cycle of pain and dependency. They spoke of her church-going habits, her supposed remorse, her delicate health. They argued she did not have the cold heart of a killer, but the tortured soul of someone overwhelmed by weakness. They asked for mercy. When the jury retired to deliberate, silence settled over the courtroom. Reporters filed outside to wait. Families of victims sat in tense clusters, some whispering prayers, others staring ahead in grim silence. Hours stretched into a night of restless waiting. Finally, the jury returned. Velma stood as the verdict was read. Her hands trembled around the edges of her Bible. Her face was pale, her eyes glistening with tears. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Guilty. The word echoed through the chamber, final and unforgiving. Guilty of first-degree murder, guilty of poisoning Stuart Taylor, guilty of betraying trust in the most intimate and horrifying way possible. Gasps rippled through the audience. Some felt relief, others disbelief. The image of Velma as a sweet church-going widow was shattered forever. She was now something else entirely, a convicted murderer, the first woman in North Carolina sentenced for such a crime in decades. But the trial was not over. With the guilty verdict delivered, the focus shifted to punishment. The prosecution pushed for the ultimate sentence, death. They argued that Velma's crimes were not isolated, but part of a chilling pattern that revealed a woman capable of killing again and again. To them, mercy was not an option. The defense pleaded for life imprisonment instead, clinging to any shred of sympathy the jury might still hold. They spoke of her fragile health, her drug dependency, her supposed remorse. They painted a picture of a woman who, while guilty, did not deserve execution. The jury withdrew once more, and when they returned, the decision was sealed. Velma Barfield was sentenced to death. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, some of shock, some of grim satisfaction. Velma herself wept openly, clutching her Bible as though it could shield her from the weight of the sentence. But there was no shield. The law had spoken. The first woman in modern American history to be sentenced to death by lethal injection now had a name, and it was Velma Barfield. Her life, once defined by whispered prayers and feigned compassion, was now defined by a date with death. After the gavel fell and the sentence was handed down, Velma Barfield was led away from the courtroom, no longer a grieving widow, no longer a sympathetic churchgoer. She was now an inmate on death row, the first woman in North Carolina to receive such a sentence in the modern era. The headlines were merciless. Death sentence for the angel of death. Prison life stripped Velma of the illusions she had cultivated for so long. Gone were the funeral dresses, the trembling prayers at hospital bedsides, the fragile act of a woman cursed by fate. On death row there were no more stages to perform on, only bare walls, rigid schedules, and the looming shadow of her execution. At first, Velma retreated inward. She clung to her Bible, spending hours reading scripture, praying and speaking with chaplains. To prison staff and some visitors, she appeared transformed, a sinner seeking redemption, a woman who had faced her crimes and turned her soul over to God. To others, it was simply another mask, one more performance in a lifetime of manipulation. But unlike the hospital rooms and funerals where she once played her part, death row allowed for no escape from reality. The world outside debated her case endlessly. Some argued she was a monster who deserved her fate. Others saw her as proof that even the most ordinary-seeming person could hide unimaginable darkness. Churches debated whether her late-life repentance was genuine or merely another ploy. Velma, meanwhile, settled into the rhythm of prison. She wrote letters, many of them filled with scripture and pleas for forgiveness. She spoke often of her battle with drug addiction, claiming it had clouded her judgment and driven her to desperate acts. She did not deny her crimes, at least not anymore, but she framed them as sins committed by a woman broken, not inherently evil. Her presence on death row was unusual. She was older than most inmates, soft-spoken, grandmotherly in appearance. Guards described her as polite, compliant, even gentle. She became something of a curiosity, a woman who looked like a Sunday school teacher but carried the title of serial killer. But beneath that surface lay the weight of her past. The families of her victims never forgot. For them, Velma's newfound piety meant nothing. No amount of scripture could erase the agony of watching their loved ones waste away under the torment of poison. To them, her prayers were hollow echoes against the memory of suffering. Years passed as appeals were filed and denied. Velma's lawyers argued for mercy, citing her gender, her age, her history of abuse and addiction. They claimed execution would be cruel, unnecessary, but the courts remained firm. The arsenic in Stuart Taylor's body was undeniable. The trail of suspicious deaths surrounding Velma was undeniable. The law had spoken, and the law would not bend. Still, Velma continued to present herself as a woman transformed by faith. Ministers visited her regularly. She prayed with them, sang hymns, and expressed sorrow for her sins. To those who believed her, she was a living example of redemption, proof that even a murderer could find God. To skeptics, it was simply her final act, one last mask to wear before the curtain fell. Yet one truth loomed over every prayer, every letter, every quiet day in her cell. Her time was running out. The execution date drew nearer with each passing year, and Velma Barfield could not pray away the needle that awaited her. Life on death row was not just a waiting game, it was a haunting. Every night as she lay in her cell, Velma knew she was one step closer to the fate she had imposed on so many others. The angel of death had traded her victims' deathbeds for her own. As the years of appeals dwindled away, Velma Barfield's final days crept closer with a chilling inevitability. By 1984, the date was set. North Carolina would execute her by lethal injection, making her the first woman in the United States to face that method of execution. The grandmotherly figure who had once seemed incapable of harm would now be strapped to a gurney, her life ended at the hands of the very justice system she had eluded for so long. In the weeks leading up to her execution, Velma was a strange mix of calm and frailty. Guards described her as polite, prayerful, almost resigned. She spoke often of God, of forgiveness, of salvation. To some, she appeared genuinely transformed. A woman who had faced her sins and sought redemption in her final hours. To others, her gentle words and bowed head were nothing more than the same act she had performed for decades, now adapted to the stage of death row. Religious leaders flocked to her cell, ministers prayed with her, sang hymns with her, and wrote about her supposed conversion. Some claimed Velma had become a spiritual guide to other inmates, offering them comfort and scripture. She wrote letters in which she spoke of repentance and the peace she claimed to have found in Christ. Her words carried weight, inspiring sympathy from those who believed in the power of redemption. But beyond the prison walls, her victims' families were unmoved. For them, Velma's prayers could not erase the suffering she had caused. They remembered the slow torment of their loved ones, the agony of arsenic coursing through their bodies, the helplessness of watching them waste away under her care. They saw her faith not as redemption, but as performance. One last mask in a lifetime of deception. The public was divided. Some argued that executing a woman, especially one who presented herself as repentant, was an act of cruelty. Others saw it as justice long overdue. Newspapers across the country covered her story, fascinated by the image of a grandmotherly killer, a woman who had poisoned with tenderness, who had wrapped death in the guise of love. As the execution date approached, Velma's health declined. She was frail, weak, and often seemed older than her years. Yet the state pressed forward. There would be no last-minute reprieve, no commutation. The law had decided, and the law would carry it out. On the night before her execution, Velma spent hours in prayer. She wrote letters of apology, though whether they were born of sincerity or performance remains debated to this day. Guards reported that she appeared calm, even peaceful. She said she was ready to meet her God. But in those quiet hours, only Velma knew the truth. Was she truly repentant? Or was this simply the final act of a woman who had always lived behind a mask? Was her faith genuine? Or was it another layer of manipulation, a final bid to be remembered not as a monster, but as a soul redeemed? In the end, it did not matter. Time had run out. The angel of death had given her last prayer, sung her last hymn, whispered her last plea. Her final day had arrived. On the night of November 2nd, 1984, the prison at Raleigh grew silent. Reporters gathered outside, their breath hanging in the cold air. Guards moved with solemn precision, their faces tight with the weight of history. For the first time in the modern era, a woman was about to be executed in the United States by lethal injection, and her name was Velma Barfield. Inside the prison, Velma spent her last hours in prayer. Ministers sat with her, reading scripture, singing softly. To those present, she appeared calm, almost serene. She spoke of her faith, of forgiveness, of a peace she claimed to have finally found. Whether those words were sincere confessions of a redeemed soul or simply the last act in a lifetime of deception, no one could truly know. At 2 a.m. she was led from her cell to the death chamber. Frail, thin, and wearing simple prison clothes, she looked more like a weary grandmother than the calculating killer described in court. Yet this was the same woman who had quietly laced food and drinks with arsenic, who had sat at the bedsides of the dying, whispering prayers while their bodies failed under her poison. The contrast was almost unbearable. Witnesses filed into the chamber. Journalists, prison officials, and family members of the victims took their seats behind the glass. Some watched with grim satisfaction, others watched with unease. For them, this was justice. Though delayed, though imperfect, justice nonetheless. Velma was strapped to the gurney. The leather bindings secured her wrists and ankles, the needle poised to deliver the fatal dose. She held a Bible in her lap until the last possible moment, her lips moving in whispered prayer. The chaplain stood at her side, murmuring words of comfort. When asked for final words, Velma spoke softly. She apologized for her sins, asked for forgiveness, and declared her faith in God. Her voice was teedy, but her words carried a weight that filled the chamber. Some believed her, others heard only another performance, a final mask worn by the angel of death. The warden gave the signal. The injection began. Witnesses watched as the clear liquid entered her veins. Velma closed her eyes, her lips still moving in prayer. For a moment she appeared at peace, then her breathing slowed, her body relaxed against the gurney. Within minutes, her life was gone. At 2:15 a.m., Velma Barfield was pronounced dead. The chamber was still. Some witnesses wept quietly. Others felt a grim sense of closure. Outside the prison, reporters rushed to their phones to deliver the news. The first woman executed by lethal injection in America was dead. But death did not silence the questions. Was Velma Barfield truly repentant, or had she manipulated the world until her final breath? Was she a monster cloaked in faith, or a broken soul who found redemption too late? Did her execution serve justice, or did it simply mirror the coldness of her crimes? What could not be denied was the legacy she left behind, a trail of poisoned bodies, families shattered, and a story that blurred the line between piety and cruelty, tenderness and murder. Velma Barfield had used arsenic as her weapon, but her true power had always been deception, the mask of compassion she wore as she delivered death. And in the end, the mask fell only when the needle struck her vein. The angel of death was gone. The story was over.